Good evening, boys and girls, and welcome to week number 1 roundup for Energy Society in the Middle East. We are talking today, or I am talking today, or having a discussion to sort of summarize and bring together the salient points of our 2 readings, the first one being Carbon Democracy, the chapter on McJihad, and The Oil Curse by Michael Ross. You've read presumably the whole book, right? Don't worry so much about the very technical bits where he's using the standard deviation of this, that, or the other. I am reading now, and I have read all of your daily contributions to the discussion forum. Fascinating, very good, lots of great ideas, lots of sort of new insights, hopefully, and I think a lot of you guys are excited and engaging with the text. I'm very, very happy about that, so very good. If at any point you feel, doing this online, that I need to sort of include something further or something is missing, let me know. Otherwise, briefly, about McJihad and about Mitchell. So some sort of thoughts that I have and some questions for you. Also, as you move towards your first response paper, right, which should be maybe somewhere between 1 and 2 pages long, double spaced. What is McJihad? You all talked about it. It's really sort of, the U.S. engaging with a certain sort of interpretation of Islam, which is highly political, violent in many cases, and is otherwise, associated with terrorism. So, again, some comments. It really is sort of the McDonald's version, the fast food version of what Islam is. And it serves a certain sort of master, the narrative. And, it sort of burns oil in order to exist. So we see that, of course, with each sort of passing war and act of terrorism. This is sort of the sort of festered fruit of McJihad. But the chapter itself on McJihad is also very interesting. It tells you, of course, the story of bin Laden and, the Mujahideen, and how the U.S., of course, is involved lockstep with these sort of terrorist organizations or these groups that, of course, are funded in some cases by Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, etc. And there's a very interesting story, of course, there to be told that has already been told, of course, for example, with John Philby. A number of you picked up on the daily discussion forum that, that this is also a story about post-colonialism and resisting imperialism, whether it's the Arab-Israeli conflict or a lot of these other sort of resistance movements that we interpret as terrorism. It's still sort of the scars of imperialism and colonialism which still persist. And oil is part of that, right? So when you look, of course, at OPEC, right? If you think about OPEC, not just the organization that sort of sets the price for oil today in 2018, it really began as a sort of band of brothers with these brown countries that used to be colonized by Europe coming together and saying, you know what? We won't let you guys push us around anymore. You can't tell us what the price of oil. Oil comes from our countries. We're going to tell you what the price of oil is. And you start getting, of course, a flurry of other organizations, and we'll see later on with atomic agencies. And and I want you guys to keep that in mind, that this is not just a story of energy. It's not just a story of oil flowing one direction or the other. It's also a story of post-colonialism. It's a story of individuals like John Philby, who, again, go to Saudi Arabia and convert to Islam and start, examining rock inscriptions. It's really fascinating. You can't make it up. So anyway, there's a lot to be told about McJihad, but I think your insights have been quite well received and are quite good. On the oil curse, of course, you've read all 7 chapters, and some points for us to consider. Of course, the 4 qualities of oil. You've read about them. Some of you guys mentioned them in the discussion forum, right? Scale, source, stability, and secrecy. Oil is not gold. Oil is not, nutmeg or steel. Oil is a different kind of resource. It is a strategic resource. This is why you have something that is called an oil curse. You don't have a nutmeg curse, right? And y'all have discussed that at length in the discussion forum. So very good. And it's all, part of the strategic resources that there's an irony to this wealth. If I have oil, if I'm a country like Saudi Arabia or Libya or Venezuela even, right, outside the Middle East, and I all of a sudden modernize and I have so much oil, and my economy is 80-90% dependent on this thing. That's in the short term, it may appear that it is sort of a blessing. In the long term sort of debate is this thing a curse, and why is it a curse, right? So I want you guys to think about why that's a curse. Ross has discussed many reasons. You're now familiar with some lingo within the industry, the Seven Sisters, right? Of course, it's why aren't they called Seven Brothers? Maybe there's some sexism in there, right? But of course, it refers to the sort of original large private oil corporations that were sort of setting the price of oil and plundering the natural resources of colonies or former colonies. Always keep that connection there with colonialism and oil, right? And the leap that led to OPEC. Other things in Ross for you to keep in mind. The three phases of oil. So he gets really deep into sort of the economy and the economics behind oil, right? And he looks at the phases from the 50s and 60s, and looking at the 70s, 80s, and then after 1990. And then you start to see the connections between sort of economics and war, right? I think one of the comments, one of you all on the discussion forum, sort of very intelligently pointed out that in one given year, I think it's 1989, that out of 130 odd conflicts around the world, 115 had to do with oil. So I mean that is a stark statistic, right? Why is it that people fight so much over oil? I mean, I think we know the answer, right? It's a heavily sought resource. A couple of other things, of course. When we look at the consumption of oil, and you look at the economy, and you look at wars, before 1980 and after 1980 is like there's a revolution. If you look at all the oil that's used, refined, etc., after 1980, it's multiple times what it was before 1980, going back to 1880. So our consumption of oil, demand for oil, supply, conflict, all of that has sort of astronomically built, with 1980 sort of as a trigger. And many things happened in 1980 politically within the region. We don't have that much time, but of course, looking elsewhere, Egypt, Israel, etc., you can sort of connect the dots. Iran. Of course, there's the Beverly Hillbilly fallacy. Just because everybody's getting an oil stipend doesn't mean they're a Dumbo, right? People are getting more and more educated, and yet the sort of oil curse persists. So it's not a simple narrative. It's not an ABC narrative. It's all over the place. There were lots. I really appreciated your answers to does oil sort of create war? Most of you, I think, were reticent to say oil creates war. Oil is associated with war. It triggers war. It sort of supplies, the weapons of war, etc., like that. So that's very good. Of course, I did mention earlier in my earlier video that women are sort of the unsung heroes. You'll recall in Ross's book, he talks, of course, about South Korea. Talks about the role of women going from sort of zero to hero. Now this is after the publication, but this is happening now in many of the Gulf countries. Women are really starting to take over. Just this week. This is not a good metric, but just this week, of course, the first driver's license was given to a Saudi woman to drive in Saudi Arabia, right? The first 10 have been given out. But there are many other things going on at universities and business owners, entrepreneurs, inventors, who are women and are Muslim and are in the Arab world, in oil countries. So keep women in mind, right? That's going to play out in another 2 weeks from today or so. And then, of course, towards the end of Ross's book, he starts talking about solutions in chapter 7, right? What are the solutions to all these problems? All these social, military, economic, and political problems, right? He begins his book by saying that, let me get this right. He says, of course, that as reliance on oil increases, that democracy, women's rights, jobs, wages typically decline. Typically, right? The word typically is important because something that Ross mentions, the greater Middle East, North Africa region, the MENA region, is not typical when it comes to a lot of sort of social indicators. And that's sort of more complex beyond the scope of our course. But the Middle East is a very interesting place, right? So finding solutions to these problems. And a part of the world where 60% of all the oil and gas sort of come from or flow through, right? It's a very important region, and it's full of conflict. So that's why we're studying this region, through that lens. Finding solutions to the problem is especially complex. But ask yourself, what are some of the solutions that Ross proposes? What are some of the solutions that are taking place right now? Right? Ross's book was published a few years ago. What are some of the solutions that he doesn't mention? I'll mention a few that he does, right? So he talks about reduction, decentralization, accountability, stabilization, transparency, investment, non-government organizations, NGOs, and a couple of other things. These are all sort of good talking points. We've heard them before. I think Ross goes into some good detail. Keep that in mind. What are some of the solutions? How does he sort of remedy or address the question of McJihad? Right? How are we as a country, say in the US or even in the West, engaging with the Islamic world, the Arab world, whatever you want to call it, right? How should we engage them? How can we improve those relations? How can we make it more equitable? How can we empower women? How can we reduce terrorism? How can we secure our energy resources and energy markets without having to sort of resort to war or revolution or sort of suppressing societies or propping up dictators? How does he get to these issues? They're all sort of really, really big subjects. There's of course a couple of other things, like curbing the global demand for energy. Look at the demand for energy now. It's sort of through the roof, right? The price of oil is up this week, by the way, folks, just in case you're driving. Avoiding stolen oil, right? Sanctions don't work. Don't talk to insurgents. And, of course, more transparency. How much of this has to do with government, guys? How much of this has to do with the private sector? How much of it has to do with culture? How much of it has to do with citizenship, right? I say this all the time when I teach this course. We're sitting down now comfortably. I'm sitting down in Houston, Texas. I'm comfortable. It's air conditioned. I have nothing to worry about. I flick the switch, the light comes on. I turn the faucet, water comes out. Everything is comfortable. In countries where, again, there's so much volatility in the economy, and they're politically unstable. You can't take anything for granted. So anyway, some things, many things for you to keep in mind. Of course, you will also recall you watched a video on, the fight for oil and the episode from the prize video called the Tinderbox. Tinderbox, of course, explodes. So why is it, guys? Why is it that oil is really associated with violence, with war, with terrorism, with economic instability, with sort of repressing women, or at least not letting them develop fully? Why is this happening? How can we get around this? What are some solutions that you've read about? What are you convinced about? What are you not convinced about? I realize it's a lot. I will try again to maybe post another clarification if it's needed. Otherwise, your next reading will be on Abdurrahman Munif's Cities of Salt, which is a much lighter read. It's a story, so hopefully it'll sort of penetrate your heart more than your mind. And again, enjoy, have a good weekend, and I look forward to receiving your first response papers by the end of tonight. Anytime tonight is good, okay? Thank you so much.